Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special edition of Conversations about CVI. I am your host today, Lotfi Merabet, from the Massachusetts Eye and Ear and Harvard Medical School in Boston, Massachusetts, the United States. And I have the privilege today of hosting our usual host, Professor John Ravenscroft. So, just for formality's sake, someone, of course, who needs no introduction, Professor Ravenscroft is professor at the University of Edinburgh, Scotland, chair of childhood visual impairment, director of the Scottish Sensory Centre, and of course, the host of Conversations with CVI. John, great to see you. And before we get started, I want to thank you first for this great opportunity to sort of turn the tables, and now we have the chance to ask you some questions. And second of all, for keeping the conversation going through these very challenging times. I think this is really a great thing that you've been doing.
No, well, thank you very much. If only I'd known how nervous people would be, I would never have done this. So no wonder people are prepping and preparing for it. I'll be much more sympathetic next time. I'm doing one tomorrow, and so I'll be really nice tomorrow. So my
Good,
goodness me.
good. It's a lot of work. There's no question. Excellent. So there's sort of three areas that I'd like to ask you a little bit about your background, of course, some of the research that you're doing now, and some of your thoughts about how research should continue, especially particularly in the field of CVI. I had the pleasure of looking back at some of your texts, and of course, I'm a fan. I've followed your work for quite some time. I've seen some of your lectures, and really quite intriguing. You have a background in psychology. I understand you even did work with non-human primates, child language, philosophy. I know that Donald Davidson is a big influence of yours. I know you had the chance to work with Dr. Gordon Dudden, who, of course, is a big opinion leader in the field of CVI. And this is all kind of related to your interests in terms of the nature of representation and theory of mind, which are really two very intriguing intriguing areas of research. So I guess the first natural question is, can you talk a little bit about your background and how did this lead into your interest in visual impairment and specifically in the case of CVI?
Yeah. So looking back, I try and connect all the dots. Where are all the dots together? And at first thought, I thought, well, there's no dots. It's just random. I just bumble into things. And then I started to really think about it properly. And yeah, so my first degree is in psychology, and I was a member of the BPS, but I was really fascinated in language. So through my undergraduate studies, the psychology of language appealed to me, right? So my final dissertation was around language and representation. So I got really interested in the psychology of language and how we process language and what we use language for, let alone Chomsky stuff, original Chomsky stuff. It was all there. And then I went on to do my master's. So I did my master's degree straight after my undergraduate degree, but I did it part-time, and I did it at Birkbeck College down in London University there. And there I did the psychology and philosophy of language. So that was the name of the master's degree. So again, language as being a really key element there. But that really opened up to like the philosophy of language, philosophy of mind. And that really got me going into that nature of representation, because language is one way to understand that nature of representation. By you speaking, I can have a figure out what's inside your head. So we have actions and we have language. That really got me going into that nature of representation. And like you say, Donald Davidson, for me, I think was much more of an influential person. I look back now and I think, for those who don't know his papers, you've got to spend a lot of time just sitting by yourself in a very dark room and going through them and trying to understand any of it, what he says. But his nature of beliefs, his nature on actions and thoughts, I think were hugely influential, and they are today. And so as I come to think about the nature of representation, I go back to Donaldson. So I was at Birkbeck, I got my master's degree, and then I did what every 22, 23-year-old person should be doing. This is pre-lockdown, of course. I went around the world, right? So I traveled, US, I went to New Zealand, and I spent a long time in Japan. And then I came back and I got a job in the psychology department at Edinburgh. So that was quite useful. And working there, I then drifted in I guess I was kind of lucky when I was there into the parapsychology department. So I worked a little bit in parapsychology. And that was fantastic, not because of the parapsychology nature of it. Statistics, right? Parapsychology do some really interesting statistics, right? Really opened my eyes up to the new way of doing statistics, right? If you're measuring luck and if you're measuring the chances of luck, you need some different ways from multivariate ANOVAs, right? You need a different way of how to measure luck. Right? So I learned a lot in my parapsychology time. And then I have to say, I have to be quite honest and quite upfront in my. So that job was going in the parapsychology, it was ending, and I was looking for a job. And then down in the School of Education, there was a job involving to working either with children with dyslexia or children with visual impairment. So I went for both because, you know, I was interested in language and how that works. And I was interested in working with, you would say, special needs, I would say additional support needs.
Right.
And so I was really interested. So I went for both, and I got the job that was with visual impairment. Now it's interesting enough. I'm still very good friends with the person who interviewed me for the dyslexia job. Now owns a Ferrari. Now has developed their own dyslexia assessment. Lives in Dubai. Does very. I keeps emailing me about what if only you had gone. But no. So I got the job with a person called Mariana Bulgins, who did a lot of work here in Scotland and in Edinburgh. And part of that work, of course, I then met Gordon. And so with Professor Dutton and Gordon Dutton, we worked very closely together. And, you know, I'm really fortunate and really lucky that I was able to be sort of guided, mentored by Gordon all the time. And, you know, it was these minutes where you just think, I'll just ask Gordon this quick question, you know, what about, you know, 4 days later, you know, I'm still.
There are no quick questions. Yeah.
That's right. I'm still trying to I'm still analyzing some of the stuff he said about 20 years ago. Absolutely fantastic. And so obviously working with Gordon, being mentored by Gordon, and then you know Dr. Blakey, Andrew Blakey.
Yes.
So on one of the projects that I was working on, we employed Andrew, and so Andrew came to work with us. So Andrew, myself, and Gordon, we all worked together, and of course, you know, pretty soon the topic of CVI came up, and so I've just been immersed with that for like 20 years now, probably way ahead, more than I care to remember. But both me and Andrew and Gordon were just really, just all the time. But obviously, I don't think we called it CVI then, and we were calling it all sorts of things, which we've gone back to, but probably brain-based visual impairment, I think, is where we started that conversation about, and we just used along that. So, so it still all links back to that nature of representation. What are children representing inside their heads when they think about things, when they do things, when they do actions, when they move? What is that representation? And it all goes back to Davidson, right? Because Davidson's got this big theory of representation, and I'm just, you know, still obsessed with that. What is it with children with CVI who have damage to the visual pathways? What is their representation in their head? Is it the same as mine? Is it augmented? Is it radically different? I don't know. So these are the things that keep me awake, I think, all the time. You know, there's not a second I don't think about this, to be honest, you know.
Excellent. Excellent. Can you share some early thoughts? So maybe initially, I know that your work was with individuals with eye-based or ocular-based visual impairment. Maybe share a little bit some of the experience that you had with that, and how do you think the case of CVI may be different in the case of ocular-based visual impairment?
I mean, so the project that Andrew and I and Gordon initially were set up was really to develop a notification system of children with visual impairment. See how many children there are with visual impairment are in Scotland. You know, this is the Visual Impairment Scotland project, and we wanted to set this up because, you know, in order to plan services, and this is not rocket science, I have to say, in order to plan services, in order to make sure that children are getting the targeted support that they need, either ocular or CVI, but this time we were really thinking of ocular, I guess, was to really see how many children there are with a visual impairment within Scotland. So we developed this project, and pretty soon we had, quite a large database, a huge database of children in Scotland that had notified to us by their parents and then confirmed by the ophthalmologist or by the pediatrician that they had a visual impairment. And we had this quite a lot, well over 1,000 children on our data set. And we started to drill down, and we started to notice that by far, those children that had visual impairment due to brain-based visual impairment was double, than those with ocular in all of its forms. And we just noticed, we added things about access to Braille, access to education system, what they did with school. So it was quite a large social and large data set that we contain. We sort of noticed the children are different, right? So to get back to your question, we noticed that there is a subset of children with visual impairment, with ocular impairment, and there's a subset of children, a larger subset by far, of children with cerebral visual impairment, right? And whilst at the time we didn't do any interventions, our project wasn't an intervention outcome-based study. It was a counting study, right? How many children there are? Let's target support to these children and to these children there. So almost immediately we had two groups. Right? Almost immediately we were thinking of, here are ocular visually impaired children, and then they're describing things like this, and this, and children with CVI are like this, and this. So we've always, from day one, as soon as the children start coming in, had these two subgroups and never really grouped them as one.
Right. And in your mind, what are the big salient differences that you observed as you were doing these assessments? And at the same time, how do you think this ultimately translates on how kids with visual impairment in Scotland are being taken care of?
Well, I think it's really important that we start to go into assessments, I think. And so whilst that project, we did no assessments and stuff, it was just a notification by the parents and then by their ophthalmologist. So we didn't do any assessments directly at that time. And even in the Vincent data that's superseded the VI Scotland one, we've not done any assessments directly on the children. But to answer your question, I think what's really important now is that we obviously don't do ocular-based assessments for children with visual impairment.
Right.
We've talked about this in our own conversation.
That's right.
I mean, you can't treat the same, right? So you have to do things differently. You have to treat every child individually, whether ocular or not. Of course, you must do that, But you mustn't assume that because you have a whole range of ocular-based tests that they're going to work with children with CVI, right? Because there's no assumption why that must be the case. These tests that you've developed for ocular children are that they have been developed for ocular children, right? So we can talk about, and I'm sure you will later on, talk about reliability and validity, but this is really important. So if you've got these tests, I mean, I'm going to give to you a typical, Bailey-Love logMAR assessment test. Right? So you go to your optometrist and you're 6 meters away or you're 3 meters, depending on which test you have, and then you sort of do your acuity score there. So these tests are reliable. I can stick one up in my study here. I can have you there. I can pretty well tell you your acuity there. Well, for that, it was meant to do that, right?
Right.
Likewise, I could go to your office and you could test me, and we'll get, it would be accurate and it would be measured to what it is. These tests have been developed and have been absolutely standardized and have the norms for children with ocular impairments, right? Bailey-Love is for all, but there are ocular-based tests, K's picture cards and all of these things.
Right.
So those typical tests are done. However, children with CVI don't have them, right?
Right.
We're not in a position to do that. So you can't just even on assessment. I'm not even talking about interventions yet, right? So even on just assessments, right, you can't assume just on science alone, right, that these tests are appropriate for these children, right? What exactly are you assessing? What exactly are you measuring? And when are you assessing where you? I mean, one of the features that my experience has told me is children with CVI, I was teaching this to a group of dancers, bizarrely, and I'll tell you about why. And one of the dancers said to me, what seems to me as children with CVI is variability across the group and variability within the child themselves.
Absolutely.
And I said, well, I've done my job here as a...
Yeah, it took me a much longer time to figure that out.
That's right. Yeah. It took me 20 years of going.
Right.
So absolutely. And I think, you know, we need to be aware of that. So any of our assessments, we need to be aware of that variability within that child, you know,
right.
and that environment where you're assessing the amount of like noise there is in that external environment. Noise as in auditory noise, physical noise, a noise that is a visual noise, and all of we need to be really aware of that. So what we are assessing really is what we're assessing, and not being confounded by all these external variables that are going on, right? Because that's going to affect the assessment scores that's going on, let alone the intentional behavior of the child, hungry, thirsty, you know, distracted,
right.
all of those things. So those things have really taught me about the importance of assessments. At some point, I'll come to interventions, but the importance of really understanding each individual's child, I think, has to come from a whole cluster of things in terms of identifying the behaviors, identifying where the CVI might be, or CVIs might be, where it is, and so your kind of work, so where it might be within the head, also the kind of event that has happened, whether it was prematurity, or whether there was asphyxiation, or whether it's a stroke, an accident, or something trauma that's going on, trying to all understand that within that child, within that assessment, I think is key. So I'm really all about trying to understand the importance of assessment so I can get at what is inside the child's head, right? There's what we can't do, and I think we do this for ocular kids, which I think is wrong as well, is just because the child has eyes, the child must see like me, right? That's just not how we do this, right? Gotcha. So we have to work at how we can get inside what the child is representing, right? What is the child seeing? And that's really to understand the assessments that we use. And then that takes us into reliability, because it's no point me having the Ravenscroft special CVI test, right? I can develop that tomorrow, right?
Right.
And so I can test the Ravenscroft special CVI test on 20 kids, and fantastic, 200 kids and 2,000 kids. And I know what it all means. That's great. You take it and you go, what is this? This is no good at all. You know, I get completely different scores. I get completely different answers. You know, this is not reliable at all. It's not, you know, and then I might give it to Gordon. Gordon can go and test, and he gets completely different things. It's maybe the same children, just different scores. So the Ravenscroft reliability test isn't reliable, right? So we need to start thinking about what is a reliable test, right? What does that mean for it to be?
Can we discuss that a little bit, because that's obviously the assessment issue obviously is extremely important, and I know that you're someone who has brought an important scientific method and methodology to research, particularly for the education field, because it's a field that historically has not, you know, really had this sort of scientific rigor, let's say, and now of course we're seeing this change. For the benefit of our audience, let's define the terms reliability and validity. And how does that relate to the current assessments that we have now? And why do you think things need to change, or what we need to do moving forward?
Well, I think I'm going to define them in a non-academic way, because I think if that's okay, I can define them academically if you want, but I think, you know, reliability is when I take a test, and imagine we had access to the same children, and we're testing at the same time in the same environment, almost in the same situation, right? You've got the same test and I have a test. I test the child, I get a score. You test the child, you get way different scores, right? So are we is that test measuring the same thing, right? Yeah, how can we have two different scores if we're testing the same thing, right? In children, obviously you can, but in that theoretical notion, what we need to do is make sure that when I'm using this test in this way, and you're using the test in exactly the same way, that we're getting roughly similar results.
Agreements.
If we're getting broadly similar results, we're happy with that. If we're getting results that are different, that need to be adjusted, that need to be changed, or need to be amended, or then we need to start thinking: is this test measuring what we, is it reliable? Can I use this in different children in different ways, and can different people use it in different ways? Okay. So I think that for me is what is a reliable test. That I'm confident if I give you the test, you will be able to score it in exactly the same way as I'm able to use it and score it in exactly the same way, and exactly the same way, and exactly the same way. Yeah. So that for me.
So how do we move forward to improve the reliability of assessments and the next generation of assessments that need to be developed?
Well, I think part of that is a matter of scale in some sense. Part of it is being able to understand that I developed that Ravenscroft CVI test. I developed that test, and then I'm able to test it with people, and then I'm able to bring in other people to use that test, and look at how that test is being measured, and over a period of time. I'm not saying the test is reliable as yet, but over that period of time, I'm looking at the children that I've assessed and other people have assessed. Is that test working the way I wanted it to do? Right. Gotcha. So whilst it might be the greatest test ever, right, it's going to take me a while to get that reliability test going.
Right. So it's replication. It's large samples. It's a statistical analysis.
Yeah, and I need
confirming.
And I'm going to throw in another bit of terminology for you as well.
Yeah.
I need to work out its power, right? I need to work out what power. And power is that sample size in a way. How big of retest do I need to show that it's above chance, right? That the data I get is just above chance, right? So I develop a test, and then I need to think, okay, how many times do I need to retest this so it'll give me a score that is just above chance. Right. And that is really what power tells me, right? So I can go online and do a power calculation, and it'll tell me how many participants I need to retest. And this obviously is affected by the number of items on your test, and what you do with it, kind of thing. So if I have lots and lots of items, I need lots and lots of power, lots of participants.
Right.
So, a simple questionnaire generally can be around, in order to identify factors and things like that, 500. So that's the kind of power things that I'm looking at. So if I'm developing a Ravenscroft questionnaire, I might need a power of 500 participants.
Right.
Just to get those factors out. But again, it depends on the size and the length of the question.
Yeah.
So that reliability measured with power, right? Because I could just have a test, right? Ravenscroft test, and you do a Ravenscroft test and we get the same results. That just could be chance, my friend. Right?
Sure.
So I need to make sure it's not just chance.
Got it. And this, of course, obviously ties in with your work with counting, because you now know, is it even such a study realistic?
Yeah,
do you even have the population that would allow you to do this type of?
Yeah, that's right. Can I generate enough power? And the answer is yes. Yeah. I think when I first started out, we saw capturing children with ocular impairment. You think, oh my goodness me! But now we know Kathy's work and Jugna's work, the papers that have just come out. We can just see Dr. Kathy Williams from Bristol, Jugna Rahi and her team in the UK there, really demonstrating the numbers of children with CVI, counted ones that are known and those that are unknown, the estimated unknown. So absolutely, we've got power sorted, right? So I'm not at all worried about the availability to generate a significant power test, right? So I'm okay with that. Yeah. I am worried about reliability. We need to develop that. I think I'm more worried about validity, to be honest.
All right. So please define that for our group and why that's the case.
Well, I think validity for me, right, you've got to be absolutely certain that what your test measures. So if I'm measuring some kind of behavior, that I'm not just actually measuring a counting system or a scoring system, I'm actually identifying the appropriate behavior, identifying the appropriate that. So validity it is what it measures. It claims to measure what it is actually measuring, right? Yeah. And that's really, really important to do. You know, you've got to be able to be confident that your test measures what it measures, and not say like a scoring system or a counting system, or because I can develop that Ravenscroft test that can that looks like it's measuring it, but actually it is measuring a way of counting.
Gotcha. And how do we move forward? You gave a great example in terms of improving reliability. You talked about scale and numbers and reproduction, so reproducibility, I should say. How do we do it for validity? Because that's certainly a much harder problem, not just in the case of CVI, but for any medical assessment or diagnostic tool.
Yeah. Well, I think you have to drill down to in each individual item. Okay, so you need to make sure that and teams and multi-agency collaborative working. So you get an item on the test, and you're describing that behavior, or you're measuring that item. Okay, so I've got that. Then to a completely different person, a person who doesn't know what I'm doing, right? These people are known as blind to the study. And I get you to look at that behavior and to mark that behavior on my criteria there as well. And so I would do this again a number of times. I might have to adjust the way that the scoring is done. I might have to adjust the way the behavior is described. So ultimately, that if I can get an accurate description of the behavior, because behavior is all I have, right? Behavior is all I have.
Right.
Behavior of that child, and I've got that measure to go with that, then I know I'm measuring that behavior, and I'm not measuring something else, right?
Gotcha.
So I'm not measuring an interference of something else. So that's how I would start to think about validity. Am I genuinely measuring that, or am I measuring something else? So it's that getting that blind person, not the person who is blind, but a blind to the study person.
Right. Yeah. Masked. Yeah.
Masked. Yeah. You call it masked. We would call it blind,
right.
double blind.
Right.
So, doing all of that way of ensuring that validity. So I need to be really sure that my test measures what I say it measures. Right.
Gotcha.
And that's the way of doing that. If on that masked sample, other people think it's measuring something else, then it's not valid.
Then it's not valid. Yeah.
Then it's not valid. I need to go back to the drawing board. Right.
So it sounds like, contrary to the discussion we had about reliability, validity seems to be much more about refinement, and it's an iterative process, and going back and reshaping, as you said, your questions and so on, to feel secure that, like you said, what you're measuring is indeed measuring what you think it's measuring.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is that reiterative process that gets it right. I've got a fairly good idea what I might be doing to begin with, but I just could be, again, it could be guesswork. It could be chance.
Yeah, it needs fine tuning. Yeah.
So I need that fine tuning, and I don't need to fine tune it, right? I'm the worst person.
Yeah, you shouldn't be the person, right? It should be the next.
Go, that's fine. Yeah, that measures what it measures.
Right. It should be on to the next person, or the next generation.
It should be the masked person who's not influenced by me, who I'm not going, has got nothing to do with me, right? And if we come back with the same thing about measuring the same behavior, it's the same criteria, then I'm confident the test might be actually capturing something. But I can't be influencing that. That'd be great.
Yeah, excellent. No, point well taken, and I appreciate you bringing this up, because this is indeed something that I think the field needs to think about. And like you said, we need the tools. We need to refine.
And it's okay. It's not okay that we don't have them yet. We've really started taking CVI seriously in the last decade or so, I think.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
People were coming back from the Second World War, the occipital lobes all shot out and stuff like that. I get all of that, and I know the history probably more than most things, but really in the last decade, we've really started looking at that.
Yeah.
So I think it just takes time to understand, right?
Sure.
And I think it takes time to also to have agreement amongst us, right? We still don't have a really fixed definition of CVI, right? And
yeah, that's a conversation in of itself. Yeah.
it is on itself. So if we don't know, if we can't define it, then how can we measure it, right? So
That's a fair point. Yeah.
So the two going out, and whilst there could be Saki's definition, there are many other types of definitions that we can use. Linda Lawrence is one that I quite use every now and then. I quite like hers. So there are lots of different definitions that we could use, and I think until we get agreement. I mean, if we look at an ocular way, we know what glaucoma is. We know,
right.
But CVI, can we define it exactly the same way? And I'm interested in conversations about that. Do we need to?
Yeah.
And some ways I say no, we don't. But in some ways, if we want to measure it, if we want to have a true, reliable, and valid assessment test, then I think we do need to define it. Right?
Okay. Gotcha. Fair enough. So just without, again, because I know that this is a subject in of itself, but maybe some thoughts in the way that we've been able to define ocular-based visual impairment, whether it's, let's say it's the cornea, let's say it's the retina, largely based on structural issues and so on. Do we need the same thing for CVI? Is there a CVI as a blanketed term? And then maybe we say, okay, CVI due to, say, prematurity, CVI due to a genetic cause, CVI due to, say, trauma, something along those lines. Do you think those subdivisions need to be done, and would that be helpful to move the field?
Well, I think you should never treat CVI or a child with or the concept of CVI as a singular thing, right? It's absolutely multiple, right? So it could be all of those things you described, but it can also be based on behavior. So if there's damage around, as we would say, around where or through the dorsal stream, there might be some types of behaviors associated with that, so there could be some clusters of behaviors associated with that, and so we would need to subset those behaviors from that as well. So I think it's really interesting because we don't have the assessments, we have the behaviors, but do we have the assessments?
Right.
So should we have a structural way of subgrouping that? I'm not so sure. Should we have a behavioral way? Should we have a premature versus
term?
Term, that's the word. A term. Term. I don't think we're there yet. But what I do know is that CVI should never be seen as one thing, right? It is. I think the old-fashioned term is. I think it's an umbrella term.
Right.
And we need to know how we're going to have those subgroups set up. Now it could be behaviors, which is not a structural way. So you could subdivide it into behaviors. You could subdivide it to premature or term or asphyxiation. It's not an asphyxiation.
Right. Mechanistic.
That's right. So I don't think we're there yet, but we need to have those conversations of how do we define it. And currently, I think we might be going down towards a behavioral way. These are the behaviors that we see.
Sure.
We divide it into that way, and I know that we can look at various websites that do that, and CVI Scotland website is doing that.
Right.
And that is a genuine way to do it. Is it the only way? I don't know. There could be other ways, like you say. We could have a structural way.
Right.
We could do it solely by, brain areas if we want.
Right.
But I'm not too sure that would tell us much.
Okay.
Because I'm not too sure what your work tells us.
To be continued. It's still in progress.
As you know, I'm joking. So we need to have those conversations.
Yeah.
And what you raise, I think, Lofty, is a really chicken in the egg situation.
Right.
So do we have those conversations before we develop the tests? Do we develop the tests and then we have those conversations?
That's fair. Yeah.
And then where does definition come into that? Does it come into once we've subdivided it? In what way, every way we're going to? It's sort of okay that we don't know, but it's not okay that we're not having these conversations.
Okay, that's fair point. And point well taken.